Tell me your name and your hometown.
My name is Charlie Bassett. I'm from Williams, Arizona.
Under what circumstances did you enter the Marine Corps? How old were you? And why did you join?
Well, I was 18 years old when I joined the Marine Corps, and the circumstances under which I joined was kind of interesting. My father had flown as a combat aircrew member on PBY Catalinas during World War II in the South Pacific, and he had won combat aircrew wings, naval combat aircrew wings, and I was always fascinated with them, and I had made up my mind about my sophomore year in high school that I wanted to be a naval aviator, and I wanted to win the same aircrew wings that my father had earned, not won, earned actually. And so I kept trying to get in the Navy, and as a young kid in high school I was kind of a little wild child, and I kept getting in trouble, and the Navy recruiter wouldn't take me unless I had 6 months worth of clean record. And not that I was that bad of a child, it was just that I liked to drag race, and I kept getting caught doing it, and I drank a few beers every once in a while, and I got caught doing that. And the Navy was having a tough time getting me through the 6 months of clean record, and so I went down and talked to the Marine Corps recruiter, because I knew that the Marine Corps would award the same combat aircrew wings. So I went down and talked to him, and Marine Corps recruiter told me, he asked me, he says, well, you haven't ever robbed a liquor store, have you? And I said, no. And he says, you ever beat up any old ladies? And I said, no. And he says, you never snagged any purses? And I said, no. And he says, we can get you in. So that's how I ended up joining the Marine Corps.
Did your parents approve of you serving in the military?
Yes, like most parents. My father had passed away, but my mom, like most parents, was reluctant to want me to go into a war zone. She didn't want to lose a son, but she's always been a very patriotic lady, and she was from the World War II generation, and she had always worked at a United States Army ammunition depot, and so she was okay with it. She knew.
How did you feel about leaving home?
Oh, I was ready for it.
Ready
Actually, I moved out of Mom's house when I was 17 years old, so I was ready to be in the service. I was ready to go out and see the world.
What specific unit were you assigned to?
Originally went to boot camp at MCRD San Diego, and then from there, of course, you go to ITR, Infantry Training Regiment at Camp Pendleton. And then once that was completed, went home on leave, and next base was Memphis, Tennessee for aviation maintenance training. And once that was completed, I got sent back out to the Marine Corps Air Facility there at Tustin, LTA Santa Ana, and was assigned to HMMT 302, which was the training squadron for CH-46s. And stayed there for quite some time, and got married in June of 1969. And there was a lot of talk even at that point in time that there wasn't going to be too much more activity going on in Vietnam, and they were already talking somewhat about pulling troops out. So I'd gotten married, and I thought, well, I probably won't get orders for Westpac. I probably won't have to go to Vietnam. And lo and behold, August I got Westpac orders. So I wasn't even married 2 months when I got orders to go. And of course they send you home on leave, and then went back to Camp Pendleton for staging battalion. That's what they called it when they prepped you for Vietnam. And from there, flew out of one of the Air Force bases, and I can't remember which one. It was either Norton or March. Flew back into one of the other two, and I don't remember which way it went. But from there to Hawaii, and it was just a short delay in Hawaii, and then to Okinawa. And in Okinawa, I think it was like 3-4 days. And then flew into Da Nang, and from Da Nang up to Freedom Hill, and Freedom Hill they sent you over to Marble Mountain, and got orders for HMM 364, Purple Foxes. And luck of the draw, that was actually a good thing. It was a great squadron, so it worked out really well.
What was the mission of your unit?
Well, HMM 364's mission, like most of the helicopter marine medium squadrons, was to support the troops on the ground, the grunt in the field. And that's what we did. Most of our missions were usually medevac missions, recon inserts, recon extracts. Usually extracts were always hot. Sometimes inserts turned hot. You picked the wrong place to put them in, and it got hot real quick, and you had to get them back out. And we had the regular missions too, resupply missions, which even those sometimes turned very hot also. And the same kind of missions pretty much rotated in and out on a daily, weekly basis.
What was your rank in your job?
Oh, my rank when I first got into country, I was an E3 Lance Corporal. And somewhere along the way, and I don't remember exactly how long I'd been flying missions, but ended up making Corporal, E4 Corporal. And at some point in time, I finally got my warrant in for E5 Sergeant, which did not get awarded to me because I got in a little trouble, and the CO tore the warrant up in front of me, and he said, "You don't get to be an E5 Sergeant now."
What was a typical day like in your life during the war?
Get up early, go fly all day long, come back, get some rest, sometimes flip it where you got to rest the next day, and then fly all night. And that was the routine all the way through.
Can you describe your feelings during combat ops?
Well, the emotions you go through in combat kind of depends on what stage of your tour you're in. I can remember my very first mission where I had picked up 2 dead Marines, and it was just regular routine morning pickup. They'd been killed overnight in some kind of ambush or action, and you know, it was tough. It was really hard. It was the first time I'd seen anybody dead like that. And we had a Navy doc that flew with us, a real doctor, not the Navy corpsman, but a doctor, lieutenant commander, if I remember right. And his name was Lederman. And Lieutenant Commander Lederman was on that mission that morning. I'm not sure if he chose it for any particular reason or if he just luck of the draw and one of them he wanted to go on, but it was the very first time I'd seen 2 dead Marines. And as you picked up out of the zone, if they were just covered with poncho liners, usually the poncho liners would blow open, and you would see exactly what you had. And it upset me a lot. One of the dead Marines he looked pretty normal and natural, except for he had just a small little blue hole in his chest. The other Marine was pretty bad. And I threw up, I cried, I was hanging out my cruise door, puking out the side of the aircraft, and I remember Lieutenant Commander Lederman putting his arm around me and yelling in my ear cup. He says, "You'll get used to it, son." He says, "It's all right, but you will get used to this." And he was right. You know, after a while, it kind of became second nature, and it didn't bother you that bad. It bothered you all the time, but it didn't bother you that bad. After a while, you kept doing your job. Towards the end of the tour, it almost got to be a challenge. I mean, Terry McDade and I, we used to joke back and forth about who was going to get more air medals. Heck, we started volunteering to be gunners for each other. So it was like we wanted to fly more. So in the beginning, it was real sad. It was scary. It was part of it that you never forget. And after a while, it became mundane. It just became what you did, and you kind of just accepted it. And there was no mission you wouldn't go do. You know, you were looking for those recons. You were looking for those medevacs. You were looking for that kind of mission. And like I said, if Terry was crewing, I'd be his gunner. If I was crewing, he'd be my gunner. We just kept doing that back and forth.
When you did experience fear, how did you cope with that fear?
The fear? Well, my very first mission that I flew as a gunner. They didn't have an aircraft ready for me. And my very first mission was a troop insert. It was, I was flying right gunner for John Nolan. And all the training that we received stateside, all the training that we received in the staging battalion, didn't really prepare you for what you were going to be shooting at. You didn't really get that feeling that you were in combat. So on our very first wave, our very first insert, I didn't fire a round. And John Nolan, as we were exiting the LZ, turned around and kicked me right square in the butt. And it hurt bad, and I yelled at him and said, "What the hell are you kicking me for?" And he looks at me and says, "Don't you ever freeze up on my gun again." And I says, "I didn't freeze up on the gun. I don't know what I'm supposed to be shooting at." And he finally yelled at me, screamed at me. He says, "You see those little flashes going off out there, those light bulbs?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that." He says, "That's your target." So, okay, now I get it, muzzle flashes, and look for that, because you didn't see the bad guy. The bad guy didn't stand out there looking at you. And I guess that's what I was expecting. And so the next wave in, I went through 600 rounds. Didn't have to tell me twice. I said, okay, muzzle flashes, I'm unloading on it. The coping with the fear of it, I didn't have any fear that day. That day I wasn't afraid, I wasn't scared. It was doing your job. Did I get scared sometimes? Oh, hell yes. Night missions were the worst. Night missions were spooky. I remember sitting in night medevacs flying out of Marble, and we'd been out on one, and we came back in and needed fuel. And I remember we were sitting over in the fueling pits, and I'm leaning out on the stub wing fueling the aircraft. We always listened to ADF. We always had the Vietnam radio frequency on. And the song started playing, "Spirit in the Sky." And that was a spooky song. I said, I didn't like it. So I hit the ICS and I said, "Sir, will you turn that off?" and he did. And yeah, it just gave you eerie feeling.
What do you think your biggest accomplishment was, and what were you most proud of during your military service?
I think probably the biggest thing that I did, there was two missions that really stand out in my mind that I did really well, and it was important that I did my job well that day. The one was when we crashed Yankee Kilo 16 into, if I remember it right, it was an Army outpost, and if I remember it right, it was called War Cloud Zulu, and we'd shot an approach into the LZ, and we were losing power, losing rotor RPM. We were settling with power. And the first officer of the co-pilot was, he kept pulling more collective, trying to get the aircraft up, and I was hanging out my crew door watching. I knew what was happening. I knew we were going in. And I was saying on the ICS, "Get it up, get it up." And we weren't getting up, and we did crash. And we rolled into, the Army guys told me later on that we had hit a mine. We'd rolled backwards into a mine. The hack on that flight that day was, Hack's helicopter aircraft commander. The hack that day was Lieutenant Cretion. And Lieutenant Cretion did take the controls after we had slammed the nose of the aircraft into a 106 bunker. And I think he made the right decision that probably saved our lives, rather than trying to swing the aircraft around and go back down the little canyon. He went ahead and slammed it hard down into the ground. He slammed the collective down and hit the cyclic forward as hard as he could and planted it. And unfortunately, it's a wheeled aircraft, and it rolled backwards. And he was probably on the brakes, but it still rolled backwards. And we hit a mine. Apparently, that's what the Army told us, was we hit a mine, and that's what blew the fuel cells up. And once that started happening, everything went to heck in a handbasket. And we were carrying small arms that day. We had mortars, hand grenades, a lot of munitions on board. We had 3 Marine grunts in the back section, back by the fuel cells, and we also had mail, and we had rations on board, food. And when we started blowing up, another place where my training came in, kicks in, and I remember they always taught us, said, "Don't bail out till things quit moving. Wait till the blades come to a stop." And once that had happened, after I watched one of the blades basically cut the aircraft in half, once everything quit moving, I bailed out my crew door and I started up the side of the hill to get away from everything that was cooking off. And it ran through row and row of concertina wire. And as I was running through it, the Army guys that were up on top of where we were supposed to have landed were all standing there watching, and they were waving and yelling. Couldn't hear them, but they were yelling and waving and pointing. And I stopped and turned around, looked back at the aircraft, and my pilot was still strapped in his seat, and that was Lieutenant Cretion. And I'm thinking, damn. So I turned around and went back down, and I went back through the concertina wire and went back down. I hit his egress button on his door, kicked the door off, pulled the D-ring on the armor plating, and reached up and grabbed him. And I said, "Helmet, get your helmet off." And he kept trying to get out with his helmet on, and the cord kept pulling him back in. And got his 4-point harness undone, and finally got the helmet off of him, and pulled him out of the aircraft. And he wasn't hurt, he was just in shock. I think he was like, what had happened? But so once I got him out of the aircraft, I got him headed in the right direction. I says, "All right, let's go, Lieutenant, we've got to get out of here." And he started moving pretty good then, but I still beat him to the top of the hill. I went through that concertina wire again. I got to the top first, and so that was a day that I'm glad I did my job the way I was supposed to. Another mission that I did that stands out to me, and I don't think anybody realized that this was even happening. I don't think anybody on my crew, maybe my gunner, because he's the one that finally got on the ICS and told them to quit raising the ramp, but we'd got called for a medevac, and it was a heat exhaustion medevac, heat stroke, heat exhaustion, well, the other, I don't remember which, but we could only do a hover aft in with ramp down to this big boulder area, and the grunts on the ground were helping lift this guy up onto the ramp. And I was, we had long cords inside the aircraft, and I was back by the ramp helping them get this individual in. And we started taking fire. And so the Marine grunts yelled it out on the radio, "You're taking fire, get out of here," something to that effect. And so the grunts on the rock that were helping lift the medevac in basically bailed. And so now I'm sitting on the ramp, hanging kind of out the back of the ramp. This guy's maybe into his chest, and I'm helping pull him in. This was a big guy, and I'm struggling to get him in on the ramp. And we went ahead and nosed it over and started leaving the LZ, and they started raising the ramp, which in one effect was good, but I didn't have this man in yet. And I was starting to slide, and I grabbed for the piston on the hydraulic actuator for the rear ramp, and the ramp's going up. And I'm looking at my hand, and I'm looking at him, and I'm looking at my hand, I'm going, I'm going to lose a hand, because it would have crushed my hand, it would have crushed my arm if it had closed all the way. And I kept struggling with him, and finally one of the gunners looked back and must have on the ICS, I don't remember hearing it, but he must have told him, said, "Don't raise the ramp, lower it," something to that effect. And I finally got the guy all the way in. And he was just a regular, we had different terms for medevacs, and I can't remember what routine meant, but this was just a routine type medevac that almost turned disastrous. So I did my job right that day too. I wasn't going to let go of him. If I'd let go of him, he would have fallen to his death, and I wasn't letting him go.
What was your happiest memory of the war?
Well, I don't know. That Vietnam was sad. It was scary. It was tragic. It was all the bad that you could ever think of seeing at that young of a stage in your life, and the things that you had to see and do. But it wasn't all every day that. Some of the things were just hilarious. Some of the hooch parties that we would have, we'd get in big water fights around the hooches, and I remember, I fell off the roof one day trying to sneak up on a guy with a bucket of water. I was going to dump it on him, and I slid off the roof and landed in one of our fire buckets, 55-gallon drum, and I went straight in it and hit my knee and about broke my kneecap in half. And so, things like that was hilarious. We used to have cockroach races, and they were hilarious, and going up to the E Club and drinking Carling Black Label and Falstaff and Slits and all the nastiest beers in the world that they could think to send over to us. You never did get good beer like Budweiser or Coors or something like that, but The enlisted club was fun. Some of the funnest things was we'd sit around out on the patio. They had a makeshift movie screen out there that was made up of sheets of plywood, 4x8 sheets of plywood, about 4 or 5 or 6 of them, something like that. Probably 6 of them, had to be even numbers. But anyway, they made a movie screen out of it. And one of the biggest movies for everybody over there was the Magnificent Seven. And it was just great. We all knew the dialogue by heart because they'd play it over and over and over. And we'd just sit in the audience drinking beer and watching the movie and playing cards. And we'd just rattle off the dialogue right along with the movie. It was great. There was there was another movie too that was played all the time. William Holden, The Wild Bunch. That was another good one. Wild Bunch. They played that all the time. We knew all the dialogue to it.
Is there anything I haven't talked to you about or asked you that you'd like to say?
No. I guess the only thing I think I might would like to add to this is that when I did finally get out of the Marine Corps, I got out on about an 88 day early out so that I could attend Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. And so I got out of the Marine Corps like 2 days. I got back home from Vietnam October of 1970, and I got out of the Marine Corps real close to the last day of August. So, you know, I had maybe 9-10 months already back home in the United States. So from that standpoint, I'd gotten used to being back home in the United States, but I hadn't gotten out of the Marine Corps yet. And I only had 2 days between separation and first day of class at Northern Arizona University. And I had registered late, so I didn't have a lot of choice of classes. And I had to take a literature class. You got to take all your liberal arts stuff. So I took, there was only 2 classes open. One was English rhetoric, and the other one was English literature. I didn't even know what rhetoric meant, so I said, I'm taking English lit. And interestingly enough, it was English war literature. You had to read a novel that had been written about war. You had to watch a movie that had been made based upon the novel. And then you had to write a report, and you had to do a verbal report. And I thought, well, you know, I'm home from Vietnam. I ought to be able to talk about war. The professor was from San Francisco. He was a long-haired hippie, metal muffin, tree-hugging, dyed-in-the-wool hippie, sandals, long hair. And the very first day of class, he asked me to step outside the classroom, and he told me point blank to my face that he did not want me in his class. He says, I want you to go to the administration building. I want you to drop my class. I don't want you in it. I don't like you. I don't like what you stood for. I don't like what you did. And I was just totally caught off guard. I was amazed. And I was kind of dumbfounded for a minute. I didn't know what to say. And I thought for a minute, and I just looked at him and I said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I need this class, and I'm staying in it, and you're just going to have to deal with it. And so I stayed in class for the whole semester. And even the students in the class, you know, they were all 18 years old, and they were right straight out of high school, and this was their first semester. They're freshmen like I was. I'm 22, and I've already seen combat. The students didn't like me either. They didn't want me in their class either. But as time went on, and my inputs to the class, read the novel, watch the movie, about maybe a month and a half into it, all of a sudden the other kids in the class started warming up to me. The professor never did. He didn't like me all the way through the semester, and he didn't like me on the very last day of the semester. But I will say this, he graded me fairly, and I got an A out of that class. So he didn't let that prejudice his grading practices. So I'll give him that. But he even told me on the last day of the class, he says, I still don't like you. And he left it at that.
Do you think the war could have been prevented? Next to that, you wrote Ho Chi Minh.
You know, about the after I'd been home for a while, I started getting more and more involved with reading the whole history of Vietnam. I started reading the big thick books about Vietnam, and reading a lot about all the different Marine Corps histories, squadron histories, our history, tracing all the way back to when HMM 364 was first commissioned. And one of the things that I found interesting reading history, Ho Chi Minh had come over to the United States. He'd worked Europe and he'd worked the United States, and he was pretty much a radical as a very young man. And he wanted assistance from the United States. He came to the United States and he worked in kitchens. He was a busboy. He worked the East Coast, the West Coast, and he was always trying to get politically connected enough to plead his case to the United States. He wanted our help. I wanted our assistance to get the French and basically at that time communism out of his country. And we blew him off. We didn't give him any time of day whatsoever. And that ticked him off. From the history I have read, that turned him against the United States. And so when the time came, he definitely wanted to be our enemy. And I think maybe if the politicians in the 50s would have given him a little more credibility, maybe things would have been done differently.
What would you have changed about your war experience if you could? Nothing.
You know, I get asked a lot what I would have done to make my war experience anything different than what it turned out to be, and my answer has always been absolutely nothing. I'm fortunate. I'm very fortunate that I came home pretty much intact. I didn't get shot. I didn't get badly injured in a crash. I got minor injuries out of one crash, but that was really minor. And so I came home without any real serious damage to my body or my mind. So I think I'm pretty fortunate from that standpoint.